Here we are again. Yeah.
Good morning, and apologies for the late start. It's not very Randstad, but we do have the Brabantse kwartiertje here, so we have some tradition in the south of being a little bit late. Welcome to the second day of the second weekend of the caucus. You're all very welcome again. My name's Charles Esche, for those of you who don't know, and I have the sad responsibility to say that today, unfortunately, because largely of the strike in Paris, or in the whole of France actually, Catherine David could not make it for our talk. We hope to try and invite her back on another occasion, and certainly she will remain in contact with this whole project, but unfortunately she's not here today. However, it has given us a rather good opportunity, about which a little more later. I would like to welcome you to the caucus. I believe that most of you probably have attended one or more of the sessions before, but for those who haven't, just to repeat that this is a project which we are engaged in over 4 weeks until the final talk on the 6th of December by Gayatri Spivak. And it is a way of trying to build a common knowledge, both within Eindhoven and the audience and community which exists around the museum, but also by inviting 30 or 35 artists from outside of Eindhoven, artists, curators, theorists, thinkers, philosophers, to form a group together with us where we can think about the question of becoming Dutch, the question of how do we understand the process of identification, the process of becoming something, whether it's Dutch or not is of course where a question mark lies, and in that process to develop an exhibition which will open in May, on the 24th of May 2008. We have an opening date. We don't have anything else around the exhibition apart from the opening date. But the idea is that in these subsequent times we will fill that in, not only with participants from the caucus but also with artists from outside. So this project is in a sense a workshop, a working project, which leads to a certain interim result. Not a resolution. I think in the Netherlands we should avoid resolutions these days. We skip far too quickly towards the resolution and don't dwell on the problem. That brings me to the opportunity that Catherine's, or the strikers, I suppose we should show solidarity with the strikers, absolutely. At the same time, it's rather sad that it results in this, but it's the fault of Sarkozy and the employers we should blame, and not the strikers themselves, let's be clear. It gives us an opportunity to relook initially at the talk by Homi Bhabha. And I think certainly one of the things that I most valued in his talk was this sense which he constantly reiterated the idea of transition and the idea of we're living within the tensions. Living within the tensions of identification or non-identification, living within the tensions of ambiguity, as he called, on global ambiguity. And I think this is something which certainly in the Netherlands, having been here now for 3 years, I'm struck by its lack. People so quickly move from question to solution. In fact, it's almost as though the question is not even finished before the solution is proposed and we've moved on. It belongs to a tradition of pragmatism, of course, but it's also, at this current moment, a problematic speed of solution. And I think that Homi Bhabha's call to think about living within this transitionality, as he called it, in this moment between, is extremely important. But much more on this and other things with our panel. I'm delighted to welcome Deborah Cherry, who is director of Esche and the professor, no? Not director, sorry. Is professor of art history at the University of Amsterdam. And she will also introduce the other panelists. So thank you very much, Deborah.
Is this on? Yes? Is this working? Yeah, good. Okay. So first let me say welcome to everybody who's here today, and I have the great pleasure of introducing our two panelists this morning. Galit, Eilat, for those of you who are here yesterday, you will have seen some of her presentation. She is director of the Digital Arts Lab at Holon in Israel from 2001, and also co-curator of Liminal Spaces, which is a research project in Israel and Palestine. And I think we're going to be thinking more about that with her presentation today. And Shaheen Murali, who is the visual arts director of the House for World Cultures in Berlin. Many of you will know him as a curator, the curator of the Gwangju Biennale 2006, and has two exhibitions in the near future. New York State of Mind at Queen's Museum 2007, and forthcoming is Reimagining Asia 2008. And as Charles has said, we are going to take up some of the themes that Homi Bhabha's lecture presented us with yesterday. Yeah, even closer. And this will be a kind of two-part response and then debate with you as an audience. First, Shaheen will give a kind of response to the first part of Homi Bhabha's lecture, the philosophical, theoretical, ethical questions in a way raised by that first part of the lecture. And in the second part of the presentation from the panel, we will see screenings and debate some of the work by artists. So Homi's lecture, second part of the lecture, was very much about artistic practices. So we will also want to think about how these two converge and what convergences there can be, what responses, what debates. And then I will just open the floor to questions and debate from you. So that's how the morning will go. So if I can first turn to Shaheen and ask you if you'd like to give a response to Homi's lecture.
All right, thank you. Just as a starting gambit, it seemed like yesterday and today here we are unpacking Bhabha in a domain which I would call Alibaba and the 40 Thieves Caucus, or something like that. It really was very charismatic, but a very dense presentation that occurred yesterday, full of ideas, full of notations and notions, which I felt to some extent it was fantastic to respond to, or given the chance to respond to, and I thank you for giving me that chance. So what I did was as usual, I courteously take notes when there's a kind of guru figure around. And Bhabha always has represented that for many people within the kind of post-colonial frame, partly because, to a large extent, when we think about Edward Said and Paul Gilroy, who provide the kind of bookends of post-colonial thinking to a certain extent, Bhabha is to a certain extent the meat in between. So it's kind of interesting to think through what a person leaves behind, maybe the stains or helping us to resolve some issues. But unpacking Bhabha is an interesting thing to do because, to a certain extent, he left us with very succinct points to go through yesterday. So what I did was this morning go through my notes and underline those points which I felt I could respond to. Not like any person in this audience, I too try to read Bhabha and skip most of it and only make sense of the odd sentence that somehow I can unpack in my experience as both a curator, I think, a person living, and through my own experiences. So in the same way, his lecture, I'll leave a lot of things out because it's too quick and too much to consume and to respond to, and I think it's unlikely that I can. Some things will only make sense at a later stage in my life when what he has thought about or thought through will impede on me. And that's how I see theory. And when I was teaching at Central St. Martin, it felt the same way, where they tried to force this idea of practice and theory. How do the two meet? So it's very interesting to think about theory as something which exists outside of practice, which I don't believe in. And as Susan Hiller said, practice is theory. So taking those sort of ideas forward, one of the main things that Bhabha started with was this idea, is there a dominant representation of the global? Which I felt was an interesting starting gambit, because we try to make sense of signs which are in front of us. There is actually a science to trying to make sense of what is in front of us. We see faces in cliffs, and we see faces on the surface of the moon. In the same way, we try to make sense of the societies that we live in and the histories which have passed through us. Now, to a certain extent, my question or my response could be that, has globalization, is it viewed as a movement, not only of people and of goods, but more and more importantly, of data across the world? not only people and goods, but data? And has that become one way of the way we represent the global? Is it one way and a current way of recognizing the notion of the global? Here, my fear is that data about continents and peoples and histories are inserted. They become sort of handable knowledge. Maybe that helps us to work towards this larger structure, which we have become to be calling the kind of global neighborhood. Now, it is a kind of shorthand way, this notion of globalization, of trying to come to terms with a world which we cannot understand, of which we are not participating economically most of the time, nor are we making decisions about. In the arts, it seems to me that we're going through a phase where we're in the midst of image consumption, a spectrum triumph of a sort, where here the disenfranchised and histories are embedded into the pleasures we seek from the cosmopolitan. So we're constantly trying to work out what is the image to represent that. Now, I always question this fresh franchise of creativity, which is now embedded in all sorts of programs, museums, catalogs, and there's a foray of material out there. The internet becomes a great source of how people view cosmopolitan. It was very strange. I was in a conference in the Delhi Biennale in India, and they seemed to know all the artworks that I also referred to, but I know a lot of those people had not traveled outside of India or even Delhi because of the lack of infrastructure for travel grants, and yet they knew those works. So it was a secondary knowledge of Paul McCarthy, Mike Kelly, which they had inserted into their own history. And that made me very scared, because the objects were never actually programmed. There are only two museums really functioning in India. One is in Mumbai and one in Delhi. And none of them have ever programmed these large-scale exhibitions. So this lack of actually encounter of the object also scares me in the way that globalization is now, the way that assets, data are moving across the world. Now here, what might be interesting to think through is that are those little fragments of information that we are getting hold of possibly more interesting and maybe more important to configure the world than the whole sort of idea of history or the whole idea of the art history or art world? Are fragments becoming more and more important? Maybe here in those fragments, which is what Barbara was trying to suggest, we find each other within this kind of visual ambivalence. Maybe visual ambivalence replaces abstract expressionism as a way of making work or managing information. Here, people have talked about a worlding of the art through a post-colonial frame, where doubt and scrutiny of modernity allows for a critical understanding of what has been called the narrative paradigm. And maybe doubts and scrutiny are the tools we need to bring to fore when we look at visual culture. In this fragmentary way of looking at the world, it becomes, and a number of the titles have suggested, a remix. The remix has been used again and again: Africa remix, music remix. And I think in this remixing, are we, to a certain extent, rearranging facts? Are we rearranging histories? And are we also, most importantly, rearranging archives? And why I bring that up is because, to a certain extent, as Spivak has pointed out, that access depends on where we stop, not where we start. And I think that's an important way to think about how we present a global picture, where we stop rather than where we start. And maybe one of the things which we can talk about, Baba, is that he had to stop at certain points throughout the day yesterday. He had to stop at certain atrocities, he had to stop at certain monuments. And he had to, his journey was, in a sense, a process of stopping, but also starting somewhere, but the stop allowed only a certain access into that archive. So I think what I'm suggesting here is that we are in the process of managing histories. But in managing histories, we can become strategic globalists as such. I think being strategic within globalization can allow real activism rather than some of the sensationalism which are attached to activism, which are so prevalent within the art world and within curating. The second point which I wanted to talk to about, what Baba brought up, which was very interesting for me, was what he suggested, which was the unsatisfied or unsatisfaction he felt with dominant spatial modes, especially the local and global. And this is what Charles was, I think, addressing in his key, not quite a keynote, Charles, but so it's outside of that binary that I think is very interesting to talk about. To a large extent, Stuart Hall has talked about this, working within the threshold, the interstitial, which really regards or talks about neither here or there, neither inside or outside. And what I thought was very interesting about what Baba was talking about was that we seem to be at a moral crossroad. Here, at this moral crossroad, we seem to be arranging the stains of our encounters. Whether they are the stains of encounters within the city where racist murders have happened, or the larger atrocities of apartheid regimes, or what's going on at the moment in Asia. We seem to be mapping and constantly defining within that stains, both the aesthetic as well as the political. And I think we are working at this particular point in our time in a very ambitious manner to create a world of engagement. And I do feel that very importantly. We are working towards a world of engagement, the way that the media and the way that media is used and the way that there's a plurality of the art object in the terms not only of serialization of the art object, but also the way that new media is employed to create vast amount of spaces simultaneously. So the dominant form of video projections, even the relationship to new media works on internet and stuff like that, as well as the possibilities of working through performances in many spaces which only take up to 2 days or 4 days rather than 2 months. So we seem to be working and involved in an ambition to be engaged with a wider world rather than philanthropy. So I felt to a certain extent there was something very positive coming out with the way that we are morally trying to be engaged. And the third point that Baba brought up, which was also very interesting for me, was of this notion of intangibility and the intersections and intersecting histories, which I would like to bring back to the other concept which he talked about, which was the linkage to the concept of slowness. Now, velocity and speed have been talked about very low, and what I'd like to draw upon is maybe in the midst of so much which gives us access, and what I mean is the world at our fingertips, airlines, clothes, shops, books, timetables, which have flattened our ability to search for ourselves to a certain extent. We are in some sort of search engine mode. We are deployed by search engines rather than us deploying them. In this form, we are hastening our search, and to a certain extent, we're dismissing the white noise of distraction, which sometimes takes us onto routes which are much more engaging and give us possibilities. So here, to a certain extent, what I'm worried about is that when we are at this speed that we function as critiques, as artists, as curators, we are also at the exclusion of competing voices within this domain. And for me, to a certain extent, this concept of slowness that he brought about should also be linked to the concept of that which is hard to find. That which is hard to find sometimes is worth the journey that it takes to get there. That fast tracking, which is happening especially in curating, where we have now the Uber curators, and what I mean by that is those who perceive themselves to be able to curate at a pace greater than their thinking. or humanly possible. And of course, they take up so much space. Now, that becomes really an impossible bottleneck to negotiate at the moment. So possibly what I'm looking at is answers in what Baba was saying yesterday, and some of them I'm also reading through to find my own answers. The fourth point, have I got enough time?
Oh, you're fine. You've got plenty of time.
All right.
Don't worry.
I know I'm rushing through this material,
Just
but
take your time. It's
yeah.
fine. We have time.
All right.
We're in slow mode.
I wish I was. So, in the fourth point is which Baba brought up, was how do you dispose a site or subject as a global memory? What he called a collective introspection. Now, there seems to me, living in Berlin as I do for the last 4.5 years, where people constantly come and tap you on the shoulder to find out where the wall was. There is a demand for history as such. And in that demand, to a certain extent, there's also a reduction of history as a touristic site. And what I mean by that is that the site becomes a site of reverie. From ground zero to backpacking on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. These have become really, really sites of tourist sites to a large extent. What worries me about this sites and subjects of global memory is in the way that we are trying to come to terms with it. And possibly this is a very subjective reading of what I feel is going on. But there seems to be a kind of a marketing of an imperial diffusion and even distribution of the notion of atrocity. And what is relevant and referential becomes deployed literally as that which becomes marketable. Now, how am I going to unpack that? Partly, sites of memory, which we have all ingested, have now started to become and look like a place where I would say we are culturally ambivalent about, to coin a Baba phrase, where we're not quite sure how to deal with it. And I think part of the problem is also the digital body that we carry. The cameras are so easy to use, the phones have now cameras, and this ready-to-use technology is creating a different way of reacting onto what we should be feeling haptically. It becomes digitized. And there's a kind of framing that happens within the space that we occupy. So what we carry upon ourselves inflicts or maybe impedes in the way that we react emotionally. And I see that especially in the way the phone, the mobile phone is constantly held in the hand, ready to use, like some sort of machine which one cannot be without. And we cannot view or talk in a world without that device. This is incredibly prevalent, especially in Asia, where nowadays, when I was in Pune, I remember I had to wait once a day for the vegetable man to come in his little push cart. Now the vegetable man has a mobile phone, and you can order the vegetables, and he brings his push cart to your door rather than waiting once a day. And that's the proliferation of technology, which is also affecting the relationship to the everyday, the practice of the everyday. So time, to some extent, is folded very, very differently to what was even 5 to 7 years ago. There is this other area which Baba brought up, and I've only got two more things to talk about, Baba, before I hand you over, which is this notion of conflictual ambivalence. This conflict, which was also in the last, how do we react to the contemporary? How do we behave within the urban? This conflictual ambivalence, what he called between annunciation and erasure, was also very, very important. I remember growing up in London and in the 1970s and 80s, where the slogan of never again was part and parcel of the way one grew up in skinhead culture. But it seems like within the 21st century, we are talking about here again rather than never again. The terms of the way that we have got used to and how we belong within the predicament of constant war and warmongering has become part and parcel of our notion of citizenship and belonging. Now, within this annunciation and erasure, how do we get beyond the predicament of war? How do we work without the tradition of conflict, war, and atrocities, but still with a past? And I want to repeat that again. How do we work without the tradition of conflict, war, and atrocities, but with a past? I would cite that there are certain artists and organizations who, for me, have been very important in thinking that through. Philip Griffith-Jones on his work on Vietnam, Trolley Books in London, Depth of Field in Lagos, Din Kyu Lee in Ho Chi Minh City, and Shiba Chachi in India, have been helpful in allowing us to have access to how we think beyond the predicament of war. Here, the way that they've been helpful to a certain extent has been through the investigation of histories, which also shapes our imagination, and artworks which are based on imaginary possibilities. And this is where the poetic relationship to art making is so important for society. In certain parts of the world, art is seen as a secondary luxury that eats the limited resources. But to me, and I think a lot of us in this room, is one of the most important languages that allows us a different way of thinking through the predicament we found ourselves into in this century. Artists allow material production that flows from one realm to another. Recently, I showed a piece of work by Jonathan Horowitz, and I couldn't believe how he managed to fold the history of Hollywood, Berlin, Mussolini, and the flight after Nazi occupation from Europe of intelligentsia in one 8-minute film. And an artist can do that, the flowing of material reality and production of that from one realm to another. These artists help us to come to terms to how to become and form human culture, away from continual denial and sometimes falsification. They also sometimes help us to think through away from the history, or history just as a repository of horror, but history also as an interpretative field, which I think is also very interesting, where we can be full of scrutiny, we can look at global antagonism, and maybe we can start to work towards what Susan Sontag has said about Abu Ghraib: the photographs are us. Now, the last point I want to pick up on Baba, because this is as far as I got in his talk, was when he mentioned the second quote for me for this response, was when he mentioned again the Susan Sontag quote, and he says, "These pictures will never go away." Now, we have, to a large extent, started and work through holding on to images of dearth, death, and dystopia, which to a large extent is about the blighted peace. And Baba talked about this notion of a trauma, to be born and birthed by our ignorance. He also talked about the fear of the unknown. And here, to a large extent, I want to bring it back to the art world. Because I do feel that the art world is an encampment of like-minded people, which are full of residues of conservative, who have great fear of plagues swamping and of migration, not only of people, but of aesthetics. And what I mean by that is that the art world works what Baba has in the past said towards its own bias, as we all do. Now, these pictures will never go away. To a certain extent, it's about the laziness of curating and the laziness of institutions to really think thoroughly through what is the condition of the contemporary. And to a large extent, institutions, curators, and artists have public responsibility. They also have to think about the control of impact and the effects of artworks, and what is cultural heritage. Because all institutions not only buy work, they save work for future generations. It's not only about local space, but it's also about international perceptions. And it's not about normality, it's about internationality. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That was really thoughtful, and I think many of us welcome such an intense, considered response, which has also taken it somewhere else, in a way. You've opened up a lot of doors, opened up a lot of ways of thinking, opened up more questions to think about, indeed, but also centered it back, again, in art, in the kinds of practices that artists engage in the work of curating, in the work of the museum, the kinds of issues that we're deeply involved in here, and the questions of community, which Homi was also reflecting on right at the end. And in a way, I'd like now to turn to Galit to ask her to do a separate presentation. That, you know, this is a rather different panel. It's kind of, we've got two different presentations, and I want them. There may be coincidences and conversations, but there are also points of departure and movement in slightly other ways. So if I can ask Galit, would you like to respond? Would you like to show some of the work? How would you like to take forward the next half hour?
Okay. I'm not going to be so constructed. So, but I would like one of the things that I'm dealing with is the question of the image. Like, if in the past the image of the world was belonged to the artists, to the painters, and I think later, to the painters mainly. And today, I think there are two wars for me. One, it's the war, what we see on television or what one can see, you know, outside of his window. The other war, it's the war on the image. Like, if, as I say before, if the artist in the past was the one that created the image of the world, today it's the media that's creating the image of the world. And I think this is one of the things that artists today have to deal and fight with all the time. We have this image, and it's not just the global image, it's the image itself, you know, who create the image of the world that we are living. In a way, I will try a bit to elaborate of yesterday's discussion and presentation, but I would like to start with to show a film, a short one, by Mahmoud Hijaj. Is a Lebanese artist. I saw his work in Copenhagen during Lebanon War, and I was very surprised to see it. So I think it will be nice he called the name of the work. It's We Will Win. It's www, and it's 7 minutes about the Israeli-Arab conflict. And one thing, maybe it's very important to say, I didn't say it yesterday. Between Israel and Arab world, there is a conflict. Between the Palestinian and Israel, there is an occupation, there is no conflict. People used to say, like, the conflict. There is no conflict between Israel and Palestine. A lot of conflicts, but mainly it's the occupation. But this is about the conflict, and I think we'll talk about it later. I think better to see first. Would you like to use your computer? Yeah, okay. Sure. Yes. We can shift to my.
Yeah, when it's running out. Peter.
Very nice. And just like
Okay, Ziad, we start with the first one, because you're bringing up problems. They're your friend. They are your friend, Deborah. Your friends. Okay, Ella, let's go. Yes.
just like.
I was afraid.
Let's do it. We gotta finish this business.
Okay. Jump.
Don't fucking in the eyes.
Okay. What? No, I don't do it. No. I saw you. You were standing behind me. Okay, go. No. Please, guys, please.
No, we do it without you.
1 minute. Focus.
Why do you see that?
Ziad, Amir, please, behave. Let's do it, please.
He's standing here.
Yeah, Ziad is standing here.
Both of you are bending. You don't stand up. You hurt.
Yes.
If you like it, don't stand up. What do you do? Okay. Bishop, over. Both. Okay. Yeah. Don't talk to each other.
Yalla. Do it.
Okay. Set over.
No talking.
Just stand one hand there, alright? Just stand.
Okay.
Both.
So yes.
It's all about love. Do you trust them? Do you trust them? Both? Do you trust them? No problem.
Okay, stop hugging. Yalla, guys, we are going to do it. Yalla, we're going to do it.
We can do it. Nobody wins, all of us.
Nobody wins, we're playing.
The rule is you jump over both of them and he jumps over both of them.
Why he will jump?
I cannot fit my hand.
Yeah.
Let's do this. Hey, yeah, come on. Hey, okay, next time. Okay, you can do it?
Yeah, I can do it. Which one? The use of army and the hand like go. Army and they are going. They are sitting. This is Arab. This is more.
Okay, can you ask?
We will win. We will win. We will win.
Okay, I'm ready. Yeah, you're ready?
Yes, I'm ready. I'm ready. Yes.
I am.
Are you ready? Yes, I'm ready.
Go! That's my head.
Let's do it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, do you trust him?
No. I never trust this.
What?
I never trust this. It's my country. It's my country. I don't trust. We don't trust. We kill. Only we kill.
Yes.
Talking about me.
Guys,
Maybe you can say. Okay. But don't go. Why is the camera not on us when we're doing the job?
because it's filming the sky.
Okay.
We do it.
Ah, yes. Okay.
Wow.
2, 3. Good one. Yeah.
Very nice job.
What are you doing here, both of you?
No, but
Very nice job, you're lying?
no, you're not even filming the job, so
But because you're not jumping. I filmed you for half an hour and you didn't jump.
didn't jump. That's true. Okay, so we'll do the job now.
When I've been waiting half an hour in the court for you to jump, and you didn't jump. And you want me to film you?
I jumped.
Okay.
No one jumped. You didn't jump over both of them.
Maybe we go and drink something.
Something, yeah. Because today I'm tired.
After, we'll do it tomorrow, okay? Bye.
Yeah.
We'll do it tomorrow.
Good idea. Yeah, we go drink. See you. Okay?
No.
Even it creates a kind of optimism because it's funny. I think it's really, in very nice way, it's described the situation in a very gentle way. A masculine world, the untrust, the impossibility to agree on anything. On the other hand, it's for me, I know also for my student when I screened this video was very strong because the body language, it's the same body language. Like if you look in distance from Israeli and Lebanese and sometimes on Palestinians, the body language, the way that we move, to speak with the hands, etc., it's the same. And this is kind of thing that hard and interesting at the same time. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, do you want to show some?
Yeah, I would like to show some more. I will show also some work by Ziad, because Ziad is also an artist. But first I will go to two Israeli artists. I think we will keep on the camera. No, it would be nice if you have a question, just raise your hand and it would be nice to how this works. It's okay. Okay, yesterday I spoke a bit about Israel. Okay, let's see it first.
המצליחה לחיילי צה"ל ומזכירה כי הצבא צועד על קיבתו חופשי.
זהו שוב פה, יום בשנה שבו ערוץ 2, הממשלה, הצבא וגל"צ מפצירים באזרחי המדינה לתרום את כספם הפרטי למוסד העשיר ביותר בישראל.
נמצא כאן בהיכל התרבות באור עקיבא, שאתם בבית יכולים להמשיך ולתרום. אם תשלחו SMS עם המילה אהבה, אהבה, למספר 3399.
יצאנו לאור יהודה. התחפשנו לחיילים שעושים אזרחי דלת לדלת בשביל החיילים, כדי להראות עד לאן מגיע האבסורד, שבו הגוף העשיר במדינה מקבץ נדבות.
שלום. אנחנו עושים איזה סוג של מבצע שלנו, שאנחנו מתרמים בצבא, אז אנחנו עושים את זה כאילו מילואים.
מטעם שיעור פה, משמעות השיעור פה?
שאנחנו בודקים אנשים, אנחנו באים, עוברים מדלת לדלת ומבקשים מאנשים אם יכולים להביא משהו בצבא. סוכר אולי, משהו כמו... אפשר שאתה להיכנס?
כן.
אנחנו במימון לשם. בואו.
מה הסיפור שלכם?
אנחנו באים להתרים מהבתים,
כן?
דברים לצבא.
כן. לצבא תמיד אני מוכנה לתרום.
במקום לגייס כסף, אנחנו מגייסים את הדברים עצמם.
כן.
פומפה, שמן, לא יודע מה, סוכר, יש לנו מברשת שיניים, לא יודע, משחת שיניים.
דברים כאלה, מה אתה רוצה שאני אתן לך? כמה דברים אני אתן לכם?
כן, פומפה שמכניסים לכיור. וואי, זה מצוין. מצוין פשוט. זה פומפה מצוינת, רגע.
אני קורא?
אני בטח.
כן, כן. טוב, אז תיקחו את הפומפה הזאת. מה אתה רוצה עוד?
מה עוד אפשר? אולי חצי לך אפשר? יש לך פירות קצת?
פירות?
כן. חצי אפשר?
כן.
חצי אפשר? אפשר את התמונה?
לא.
למה לא? אבל אין לנו, אנשים נורא מתגעגעים במשפחות שלהם. חיילים בודדים רוצים לתת תמונות של משפחות אחרות.
לא, תמונה לא. רגע, אל תיכנס לשם בלי רשות.
רגע, בלי רשות אל תיכנס.
לא, רגע.
מה זה? יש לך פינצטה אולי?
לא אתן לכם פינצטה.
אבל התחילו לי שערות בין הגבות. בין הגבות, יש לנו כזה שערות. תסתכלי לי שנייה.
בואו אני אעשה לכם בחוץ.
גיא פיניסון, אחרי זה? זה שיעוטרון? כן?
תגידו לי מה אתם רוצים.
רגע, קודם כל...
תעמוד תגיד את הראש.
תחזיק מעמד, אוי זה כואב. תשים לי רקליק, יש סיפור דבר. זה טוב, זה בסדר גמור, זה לא כואב.
אדון יכולת את זה הבנה לאנג'ו.
לא, תסתכל. וואי, מה זה? רגע.
אל תעשה ככה, אני לא יכולה. מה קורה לך? אתה תתפשט, אני אעשה לך למטה. בוא למישהו.
רגע.
תתפשט לך את
הילה, מה עם התרומות? ספרי לנו.
אז ככה, כרגע אנחנו עומדים על 16,412,546
16 מיליון.
יש את השירוטרון, שיום שלם כל המדינה, כל הכוכבים של המדינה מתנדבים בחינם בשביל לגייס כסף לצבא. עכשיו, זה בלי קשר למה שאתה חושב על הצבא, הצבא לא צריך כסף, הרי מה זה היום יום של נדבה, שכולנו תורמים.
כן, באמת, אני חשבתי על זה, אתה יודע, אמרתי, למה? מה, בשביל מה תורמים? יש כל כך הרבה כסף. נותנים להם, לביטחון וזה, מה השירוטרון הזה? על מה?
אהבה, אז בבקשה.
הוא נראה מוזר, מכיוון שגוף שמחזיק תקציב של מיליארדי שקלים, אין לו 10 מיליון שקל לתת לחייל לרווחה שלו.
אני נגיד חושב שהחולים במדינה יותר חשובים מהחיילים.
לא, אל תגיד את זה ככה, זה לא נכון.
זה נכון, אבל
חיילים זה חשובים מאוד.
לא, הם מאוד חשובים.
תשמעו, היום זאת ההזדמנות שלנו להחזיר לחיילים אהבה.
זה אפשר?
תיקח את זה, כמו אני אגיד לך.
יאללה, תביא את הבלטה. תודה. באיזה חייל החיילות הכי יפות? חיל הברקום. חיל הברקום? והייתה לך חברה חיילת פעם? אולי אתם חייבים את כל המנורות?
אני יש לי ילדה שהיא חולה מאוד, אפילו אין לי תרופה למחלה שיש לה. תחזור, אני רוצה שאני אגיד לך, יש תרופה שהיא מונה, וגם את זה גם... מי שתורם את זה מחו"ל, אנחנו מקבלים את זה.
אז למה את חושבת, לא עדיף שיהיה יום במקום השירוטרון, שיהיה יום שנקרא בריאוטרון, שתורמים לבריאות?
אבל לא יתרמו, חבוב.
למה לא יתרמו?
אמר לך על הזמן,
אנשים לא יתרמו לבריאות?
אני לא יודעת. תגיד לי, למה אני שואלת אותך שאלה? למה לאלה שבאתי לא דואגים להם?
אני גם חושב. אני גם חושב.
אני חושבת שיש להם מספיק כסף.
אז למה תרמת כל השבוע לצבא?
תרמתי כי לא היה לי ברירה.
באור יהודה פגשנו אנשים טובי לב, שמבינים שמשהו פה מסריח, אך ליבם רחב מכדי לסרב לתרום. ראינו איך הצבא, הממשלה והעוד 2 לא מתביישים לקבץ נדבות מאנשים שפשוט אין להם. חסר לנו קצת סוכר או לחם.
גם סוכר וגם לחם וגם שמן תקבל.
רוצים קפה? זה בסדר לקחת קפה? קצת אולי שוקולית, טיונים, אין לנו טיונים פשוט. תודה.
זה מותחת את הטלוויזיה, זה אפשר לדעת?
תהיה פעם פה איתם. לא צריך את הטלוויזיה. לא צריך את הטלוויזיה, אבל יש לך. יוסי, חסרים לנו שלטים למזגנים? והתחתית טובה לקחת את המזגן עצמו. איפה המזגן? איפה המזגן? אנחנו רוצים לצלם את הכל מראש.
לפני שייכנס אליו? ממש בדיוק.
ואז שהחלטתי פשוט נוסיף את הטיל לכתבה. אבל אנחנו מדברים עם אנשים שכאילו היו במקום.
לא עדיף.
עליית מדרגה רצינית בעימות עם החיזבאללה. אנחנו 2 דקות לאחר שנפל הטיל ברמת גן. אנחנו כבר הגענו למקום. אנחנו מדווחים לכם מהשטח.
חזרתי מהפיצה ופתאום היה פיצוץ וראיתי אש. שמעתי אש ראיתי.
הרגשתי פתאום שהבניין ככה קופץ.
ופחדת?
אני אגיד לך, נכנסתי לחרדה.
מה ראית?
שמעתי אזעקה, עליתי לממ"ד, ישבנו חיכינו לבומים.
ובדיוק כשחזרתי, תפס אותנו הטיל.
אתה ראית את הטיל?
בערך.
לציבור? הלכו שיהיו להגיע, יחיו את השגרה שלהם, ואיך אנשים יאכלו טילונים נגד טילים.
צבא הכין לכם מקום באזור קריית מלאכי, ים המלאכים, שם אתם תוכלו לנסוע לשם, תיקחו לכם מי עדן וציוד אחר, ותוכלו לשהות שם כמה זמן שאתם רוצים. את החתולים אתם יכולים להשאיר פה, בסביבה, אין שום בעיה.
ראובן, איפה אתה? אל תשאל, בוא תראה מה קרה לי. כולי צורה, נפל עליי משהו. עברתי פה ברחוב, כנראה צמצה איזה שמשה ונפל עליי איזה זכוכית, לא יודעת מה קרה.
וזה בעלך פה לידך?
כן, זה בעלי,
הוא ישמור עלייך בתקופה הזאת?
מקווה. איזה כאבים, עוד.
ואתם מתכוונים להישאר ברמת גן אחרי האירוע הזה?
למה נלך? למה אנחנו נלך?
לא יודע, אני שואל, אולי יש לכם חברים בדרום.
מותק, לא, אין לי אף אחת, אני לא הולכת לאף אחת. מה שיהיה, אז יהיה מותק, תסתכל, אני עברתי יותר גרוע.
יושבים בבית קפה, שותים קפה, זה בלי פחד, אנחנו רגילים, זה לא פעם ראשונה וזה לא פעם אחרונה, אז ככה הגענו לדברים האלו וגמרנו.
Okay. What I like very much in the second film with Marcel on Ramat Gan is the way how people participate in this game. Everybody aware to the game, but they participate and they're repeating exactly and quoting sentences from real events. So everybody know how to act, what will be the reaction. It's completely like kind of a rehearsal or something that happened already. And this is very interesting how they first it show, I think those two films show a bit about the Israeli society. It's not so much about the practice or the way or the film itself. It's more how you know the society, like the people that you meet on the street, how they will participate and accept immediately to play with you the game, even it's clear it's stupid and don't have much to say. And I would like to show something from Ziad Antar. We saw him in the first film. And the guy with the girl.
Tokyo.
Okay. I will show just another one. I think it's better than to talk, just to make kind of a visual essay through different videos.
סקס לוקח גם כפה? סקס לוקח בגדול. סקס לוקח בגדול. ואני... זה הכל בשביל ציור טוב. שנייה,
גם לא.
בוא ליד כולם, תמצאי לי, כן, גומרת בפה על בולעת הכל מה של הכיפה.
אולי את האבן את מקבלת. לא, איזה רוע.
אני נותנת לך, בוא נתן אותי אותך. בוא זמני, קבל השושלת?
וואו, ממש...
זה ממש אוהב את מוש, כן? כי ממש רוצה לראות אותם זה והיה לי ממש סבבה, כאילו אני חוצת את זה, כן? אבל אתה שושלת לא היה טוב. זה גם לא נפל.
למה יש עוד לא כדי מהר?
זה קורה קורה כאילו, וואו.
אין מחיר. את השושלת הראשונה שלי.
מי לא?
דברים שאין להם בכלל. תשמעי, אני רוצה להגיד לך משהו. תקשיבי לי רגע.
בגלל זה מאוד נורא.
נראה לי שאתם חושבות שבנים נכונות, כן?
כן,
אבל...
אני קשה לעשות. מה רוצים לעשות? הנה, אני אעזור. הוא לא מנופח, לא מנופח מספיק. כן, בדרך כלל לא רואה לא מנופח. יש שם קרע סמנטית. אני מתפקדת אותו בים, הוא היה... הזמנתי אותו להצטרף אליו ולחברה, והוא פשוט כולו הוריד כזה בא לחוצה עם מגבת ככה ביד, אפשר להצטרף? אז כן, בטח. ונוסע אותו, אני יכולה להגיד נכנס, אז אתה מבין נתונים כאילו? אז כן. אני מה, אתה מבין שזה חופשי? זה חופשי כזה. מה? וואו. כמה שזה נשמע לדור שקיצ'י ווואלה חנטרישי וואלה זה עצמי משהו, אבל וואלה לא פקידה בקריה או משהו זה ככה 18 שנה אני אמור להכין אבא שלי קפה, אני לא מכינה לאף אחד קפה בשנתיים שיחלום אני השתילו על הקפה
תקשיבי, הסברנו אותה לפני חודש כמו שקרה בנצרים עם עדי אוסמן אם היא נהרגה באדם שלה, בשביל המדינה שלנו גם לפני 50 שנה אנשים נהרגו בשביל שהעם הזה יוכל לחיות במדינה פאקינג, תחשבי שעם שלם יהודי יכול לחיות בכל המדינות בעולם יש לו מדינה שלא פוחדת שהשמאל גדולים אנחנו צריכים להחזיק ולהילחם על המדינה הזאת כי לערבים לפני זונות אין מדינה ואנחנו לא ניתן להם מדינה בסוף אלא אם שזכות המדינה יהיו באיזה שיחת מדינה ובצים פה יאללה בואו נעשה התעשתות רביעתית
איך עושים את זה?
עשיתי את זה פעם ישבתי מרו ממש בזמן
איך זה נשמע מזוס?
זה הפעם נשמע
מזוס
כי זה מה הקטע מה זה היינו 15 מה 94 שנה היינו 4 בחורות ועכשיו השתיים נהגי בלשון אז כולם הביתה אני רוצה לא הגיבו על זה ואני לא הגיבו על זה אמרנו טוב בהתחלה כל אחד עשינו כזה סרט תשת איתה ואחרי תשת איתה ואחרי זה עשינו ככה נשיקה רביעתית לא, זה היה משהו מטורף מטורף כזה קראנו לזה ערב עקץ ערב כישרונות צעירים עשינו כל אחד היה רושמת יום
Give me that yummy gummy.
Where is the command Q here? I think it's better to end now. If not, it will become more and more depressing. So I think the last one was enough, I think, for everyone.
So let me just very briefly thank you for showing us such a really wonderful range of work. And as you said, just to let the art speak for a bit. It was quite nice to really have a chance to see work that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to screen at the event. But it brings together two very different presentations. Is it on? Yeah, two very different presentations. And for me, I think that there are some similarities. There are some questions that come together that might converge. And I thought I'd just say a few words before we open it up for debate, and please ask questions to either of the participants or to both of them. Think of the ways in which you'd like to ask your questions. But for me, we talk very readily about something called a work of art, but we could also ask, what is the work of art? And Shaheen talked about the work of engagement, and that clearly is something that might cross over into some of the films that we've been looking at. The question of making a practice which is engaged with certain issues. But also, and this draws me as an art historian onto my second way of thinking about what I've been listening to this morning. And that's a question of visuality. What kind of visual modes, what kinds of visual expression, what kind of visual forms and aesthetics are artists using? I mean, we've seen a lot of work in the last 2 days in very different visual modes. Some of it's very spectacular, the cinematic mode, which has very particular strategies of affect, very highly emotive, highly emotional, often very narrative, working with particular forms of catharsis towards the end. And often that kind of cinematic film does have an ending, even if it's only a provisional ending. Some of the work we've also seen just now is working in a very different visual genre. I mean, there are lots of visual genres going on here, but what is this kind, how are different genres evolving? Why are artists choosing to work in particular genres? The documentary, which is also so much a genre of our time, the homemade movie genre, the way in which the camera's moving, the way in which subtitles are working on the screen. And the first film you showed, I thought, was really fabulously complex visually, and in the relationship between vision and text. We're asked to look, we're asked to read, there's some quick-fire editing. So the whole visual panorama, in fact, that we're working with, and I'd really like to kind of pull that to the surface. I think, too, the question of both history and the present came across in both of these presentations, for me anyway. the question of how do we deal with the past, which has within it, deep within it, this trauma and conflict, but also, as you were saying, Shaheen, it's an investigative film. It needs bringing to the present, investigating, interrogating, reframing, and often this goes for visual material, that visual work is often using so much material from the visual past, that there is a legacy of images, a legacy of visual strategies, which recur time and time again, and the artist will draw on in making a particular work. So the question of history isn't just to do with the archive in terms of a historical archive, it's also in terms of a visual archive. So this question of history. And also to return to the question of Homi Bhabha's talk. Underlying Homi Bhabha's talk yesterday was Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin's thesis on the philosophies of history, in which Benjamin puts forward a notion of messianic time. Homi Bhabha was talking about the messianic in terms of discourse. But for Benjamin, it's messianic is a sense of time, and it's a time in which the past rushes into the future through the present, and that can be a catastrophic rushing through it. It's a form of time collapse between past, which reshapes the present, and that sense of how do we deal. I think Shaheen was speaking earlier about this sense of how do we deal with this digital rush of time, this flow of images which transmits so quickly. And one strategy might be to arrest that, to pause, to stop for a moment, and also to pause and stop for a moment by looking differently, to look at the work of art, which can pause us in some of the ways in which we are thinking. So to slow down and to take time. And often, I think, too, that we're looking at time-based work. One of the things that artists in the present are asking us to do is to slow down, is to take time. I mean, we all know that when we go to Kassel, we rush there and we might see snippets of artworks, maybe 2 or 3 minutes of a long film. But what we've been able also to do this morning is to take a little time to slow down to watch work. And I think that's part of this engagement with the slowing down of time, which might be another way in which we could see some threads through. I don't want to put it any more than that, because I want to be able to hold on to both the different domains and also the intersections between. So with that, I mean, we've got now around, I think, a good half hour this morning for debate and discussion. And as I've said, please ask your question to any of the participants on the panel. And, well, over to you. We've got a question here. And as usual, people wait for the mic. There will be a mic upstairs and downstairs.
Yeah, I would like to come back to what you mentioned, the fear for certain aesthetics. How can you link it to what Deborah said, that there are lots of strategies used and produced? Then when does the fear start? When does an aesthetic is that strange that the curator is afraid? Or when does the unknown start? Is that the vision line the West, and what is beyond the West or outside of the West, and what is that?
I think the naivety of the art world is that it's seen not as an ideological structure. It's an ideological structure which is policed heavily, and always has been. It has lineages, it has heritages, it has its own cultural worlding as such. And there is not only a lingua franca within the art world, but there's also a type of art world, which is the art world. And I think the fear comes when curators try to negotiate and try to work. It's been said that curators are possibly the translators, the new translators within globalization. That you need curators now to be able to translate the amount of material which is out there for and within the public sphere. we have an imagined community of audiences, which also needs to be thought through, because I don't think there are audiences, there are audience. It's still in its infancy, and there's very little that a lot of institutions do to tackle that issue. There is a kind of a lack of contribution to the notion of community or communities which could be developed within visual culture. There's a lack of nearness or even an agency within institutions to unpack their own resources so that they are available in a manner which makes entry to the domain of the collection and the art world accessible. So there's a great amount of neglect out there on what could be possible. If anything, there's an anti-production of audience going on in the way that art is now organized through resources being used and skewed and placed around the world. And what I mean by that is that public resources are used for private facilities, and private collectors also use the notion of a gated space. This is happening everywhere. It's not only in Brazil, it's in Mexico, it's in India, it's everywhere. It is a part of the mutation of the market.
This very last one.
The mutation of the market?
Yeah, just
well, I mean, the market is as buoyant as...
Anti-production.
There is, I think there's a large amount of work done within supposedly the public sphere, which doesn't allow entry for the public, because it's shrouded and clouded in a manner which creates its own language and doesn't allow the emotional sedimentation of art to be lived through. And I think it's also partly the way that artists are also beginning to make work, that they work within a certain trajectory, which is a given trajectory and a given point of access into resources, whether that resource is commission, collection, monographs, whatever you want to call those resources. I don't think there is a real impetus to change the situation. And I think it's something which I'm very fearful, because I think it's actually becoming, in places like Germany, which I know quite well, it's becoming more and more romanticized notions of parallel knowledge. And that kind of comes up once in a while. There's also, I think, agreements between institutions and characters who work with institutions, for sort of like collaborations, which lives out a whole other wandering mendicant type of artist and art world.
Galit, would you also like to respond to this question?
I want to respond.
Yeah,
I want to respond to what Shaheen is saying. It's a lot of things. So, one thing, it's funny. My next stop is in Gdansk, and the event called the Curator as Translator. And I look in and I ask myself, okay, what I'm doing there, and it's around our archive. Our archive is traveling now between different kind of institute, kind of open offer to other institute to have an archive, and later on, for a few months, and later on to have the whole archive. So it will travel, and any one of the institute will add some works, 25 works to this archive, and then all of us can have like in Bristol to have an archive with a lot of different visual material from different ends. But it's one thing that distracts me. It's the art world, the curators, the artists. We are the art world. We are the curators. So it's not the mechanism. It's there, and what's happened there. It's what we engage with, and how we would like to imagine it, and how we would like to work in it. So it's hard for me to hear about the mechanism and the movement of the market and how it's operate. It's something that I'm just an observer of this situation. My question will be like how we can operate, how we can create different situation, how we can talk about value and not just the value of the market, how we can, go out of this kind of agreement between institutes around certain artists, how we can circulate and open it up. I think this is the most interesting and advanced question instead of observing and point out the situation right now, because the situation right now is a situation that already exists many years.
Because in a way, Shaheen, aren't you suggesting, that in this cultural worlding picture that you've given, that there are no resistant forms? Whereas I think you might differ with that art can form resistances, that there are that there are cultural worldings rather than a cultural worlding, and that there can be plural and resistant and antagonistic forms within that world. But do you really have such a pessimistic view as the one you just outlined, or do you think that there are resistant arenas, resistant forms of art, resistant communities in the art world?
I think there's a lot of co-option going on. There's a kind of meta-hosting also going on within the art world. The large-scale art fairs like Frieze and Basel, and large-scale museums with a great amount of power, economic, and which creates value because of the way it structures the archive. I believe that we have what Paul Giro talks about, responsibility to thicken the archive, as you suggested, because the archive is very slim and very thin at the moment, and we need to have all of these competing voices within it. But the response from the art world has become, the demands of the art world has become that entry to it is largely structured through very guarded entry points. And I think that the formats which are available at the moment for artists are becoming much more seemingly prolific, a great amount, but at the same time, the sort of rise within that is very, very, I think a lot of artists grapple with it and cannot get anywhere through it because it's so cloudy, it's so, and I use this word meta-hosted because it's a kind of a meta system which doesn't allow, which structures regardless of what the community of artists want, or what the object of art is, or what the world is saying through art. But it doesn't mean that there aren't possible roles which can remain intact, or there are not ways to fight through it. I think there are a great amount of the rise of the project space, for instance, is an interesting little encounter, but it's usually people's living rooms. And it's the private when it becomes that public space, which also for me is fraught with tension of how do you read that. And they have no longevity. They come up and then they die. And maybe that's fine. But this is the condition in Berlin. It's fraught with project spaces where 3 months later, and it's the same in actually Beijing. It's the same also in artist villages in Beijing, which there are many of. At the moment, there are 3 artist villages in Beijing, and they will move because the way that society impacts on territories of art making.
You say artist villages? Like, yeah. We will have like a village, yeah, there is one in Israel, like a lawyer villages, like, you know, kind of occupation, people living by occupation. It looks like...
it's...
frightening.
There was a term called gazumping, which is very specifically British. You would know about it. You were into property. Yeah, I don't believe that. He comes from Edinburgh, so you have to watch him out. Gazumping was a term which was used when you'd pay your mortgage and somebody else would say, I'll give you 10,000 more and give me the property. And you were gazumped. And artists are constantly gazumped within the urban condition. And in China, it's an amazing thing. Artists now have 2 or 3 studios only because they know they'll have to move out very quickly from the first one. And it'll be within a space of like 2 or 3 months because of the state of development. And I think that's also the sort of the speed of economic. Yeah. But that's also happened in London with the whole Hoxton thing.
But nevertheless, however temporary these spaces may be, I mean, if we look at something like liminal spaces, I mean, that proliferation of different strategies that you have, the different spaces that liminal spaces has, does offer a different kind of view of what we might call the power of art, the work of engagement, as a resistant form, or as a form that can challenge or rethink or renegotiate the social field through a set of visual and other strategies. And I don't know, I mean, do you want to say any more about, I mean, it seems to me that your position's rather different in this.
Yes, but I want to talk something, you say liminal, I want to talk about liminality and something that related to yesterday's talk about also about the translation, the trans possibility and the liminal possibility, the possibility to be at the same time in between and at the same time in the 2 places. I think this is, from yesterday's talk, it was the most important for me, this kind of possibility to stay with not in one place, not with, to think about something which is in trance, and also in the Angel of History in Walter Benjamin, when he talks about the Messiah, in the Jewish tradition, there is first will come the Messiah ben Yosef, and then will be the big war, the Gog and Magog. Ronen, correct me if I'm wrong. And then Messiah ben David will come. And when Messiah ben David will come, it will be like the peace period and, you know, all the things that we can imagine when the Messiah will come. But first, before, and maybe this was the idea about Bin Laden first, or 9/11, which I don't think it was the collapse of everything, but the idea it's like first everything will collapse. This is why, for example, and
as a warning, it doesn't have to be that.
yeah, but I think it's also why, like Zionism, it's kind of a messianic movement. First was the Holocaust, and then, you know, Israel established. So it's kind of a process with a warning, or with a global war, and then, or a war, something which a big crisis, and then it's the messianic. Yes.
There's a question here. Can you
thanks for allowing me to ask a question. 2 questions. First, you talk about artists and curators. You don't mention critics, art historians, aestheticians, the audience even, in your presentation. How can you expect the curators to be translator when they're not dealing with any of the other actors in the field, let alone into one language only, the one I'm speaking at the moment? And the second question to our colleague from Israel is, does it matter that the Arab goatherds trained to utter the word Tokyo probably didn't know that the music came from Okinawa?
Do you want me to answer this one?
We can start.
I'm not sure, Don, who the question's for, but I'll take
It was a Lebanese. By the way, it was Ziad Antar, and he is a Lebanese artist. He's not an Israeli.
I don't care where it is from. The speakers to the camera did not know, very likely did not know that the music was not from Tokyo. It was from Okinawa.
Let me
so
do.
It
Okay.
didn't matter to the producer that they didn't know that they were being put against music, which had nothing to do with the ostensible.
Let me just perhaps offer 2 responses. If we talk about artists and curators, I don't think that's exclusionary to other practitioners in the field. So we could, of course, mention aestheticians, historians. I'm an art historian. I think I said that at the beginning. I'm also an art critic. I have been a curator. And, you know, I mean, we all have, dare we say it, multiple identities. So something that came up yesterday. But there are many actors, and I think Shaheen was actually talking too in this notion of cultural worlding. There are museum curators, actually museum people who are working in the museum have made the event available for us today. So we know in the art world it's a field of many actors, which extends widely throughout the corporate field as well. So there, and many other fields are involved in what I think you rightly called cultural worlding. And I think that a complex film like Tokyo Tonight, for me, is I mean, it's the first time I'd seen this film. There are all sorts of questions about what the music is, how it fits, the level of irony that's intended, the level of layering. And, you know, one might want to, as an art historian, I'd want to do a little bit of research and, you know, find out what bit of music and did it matter? And if it did matter or if it didn't matter. I mean, for me, that's the kind of job of the art historian. That's what art historians do, as you do, in kind of finding out this kind of, you know, what is the relationship between this potential mismatch and then why did the film get the title Tokyo Tonight? And what is it that Tokyo might hold in the cultural imagination that puts it in the title, which Okinawa Tonight might not have done? So I think the film, for me, raised all of those films raised a set of questions about image and text and the mismatch. I mean, Shaheen was talking, you were talking about the significance of the fragment in the digital circulation and these fragments of music that come up, fragments of text, and you know that this video work demands that we interpret them very quickly and interestingly, and sometimes we put things together in interesting ways as receivers. So I don't know, did it matter? That maybe is the question that's still open. Yeah. You don't need, you know, maybe there are going to be lots of answers, that it mattered or it didn't matter or whatever. Yeah, Annie.
A few thoughts, really, partly coming from yesterday, and maybe I'd like to address something to Shaheen or maybe both of you, about this idea of identifying the notion of the condition. I think Homie talked about this yesterday, that we can kind of think of the global as a condition, but perhaps it's more important to think about the position. Because what I get a little bit worried about when I hear this idea of arranging fragments or the art world is this giving away of our potential agencies. That the position is actually the acknowledgement that we're actively within, whether resistant or conforming or being co-opted, but that there's that kind of critical responsibility constantly built into the situation. And the second thing I'd love to ask both of you to respond about would be, again from Homie yesterday, this idea of the transmission of barbarism, this kind of responsibility not only to remember or to represent or to show, but how do we think about this notion of the transmitting?
Shall I start?
Yeah.
I think just to talk about, there is a substitution of agendas. And there's an alliance which has been built up from magazines who act as schools to art fairs which act as patrons to curators who act as within what I call artist envy. There are all these sort of very strange roles which have become mutated to what I think of as exhibition organizers sometimes and administrators. There is also, I think, there's a certain amount of critical indifference to all of this because it's hell-bent on a model of success and rapid growth rather than rapid development of knowledge building. So exhibition making hasn't become the vectors of communication as much as the vectors of having worked with certain artists at a certain realm and with certain galleries. This is a very kind of patriarchal structure at the moment, which is what I meant by the kind of uber curators and curatorship. So the position is partly co-opted, although it looks very sort of lingeringly looks like with a bottle of Beck's at something being outside. It's what I've always thought as a side fuck to artists rather than a straight. And I think there are sort of institutional challenges and changes which need to be made. But I really do think that we are in a very strange position at the moment because of the way that the autonomy of thinking and this what you called the position of holding critical responsibility has been given over so much. We've lost so much ground on all of that. That it's very difficult to make virtue out of this necessity, which is how we become part and parcel of this structure. So I am quite negative about the way that it is, because I do see things. I've traveled to about 20-odd countries recently, but there's an incredible investment structure at play. And it's not only in Europe, it's in Asia, it's in Latin America, it's everywhere. And that investment structure does impose and impede on the way that artists make and the time that artists make and when and how they show.
No, I mean, I think it's incredibly important to talk about this and the strength of the art market, its possibility to co-opt. But I think it's also very important to enunciate the resistances to that. I mean, the attempt to think, for example, the museum as a place of knowledge building or taking its pedagogical sort of responsibilities as something contrary to the market, perhaps.
Maybe, perhaps, but yeah, it's two things. Maybe I will write it down. I first answer this and then the transmission, because this is a very important. First, I think there are different kind of structure of museums, like the one in the US. They are mostly private. Sure, yeah. Here, I think today it's more hybrid between private and public. And when you have a museum which is private, the board will decide what and how the collection will be, And most of the time, the boards are, parts of the board, or most of the board are collectors. So I think in this sense, the museum, it's one of the big agents of, of the market and one of the big, it's like, and I think maybe the structure of a smaller institute or institute without a collection, they are the ones, or with an archive instead of a collection, that still you have the visual material, still you have, you can build, I think, especially with video, with painting it's another story, but with video and photography, you can build this kind of history to preserve it, to keep the image and not the value of, of the artwork. And I think the museum is part of the system, whatever you look, if it's private or if it's public. Because I can take like the model of Tel Aviv Museum, which is public museum, but still, at the board of the museum are the collectors, the Israeli collectors. So it's influenced very much, what the museum will buy, from whom, how much, and when. Something about the transmission. The transmission, we use it a lot in Israel for the third generation. It was like a few years ago, it was the second generation of the Holocaust, and now the third generation. And the word that's used most of the time is the transmission, how it transmits, and if it's implemented, if the transmission will succeed. There is Artur Zimayevsky work that he asked, 8014, I think, that he asked the old guy to rewrite old Polish man, his number. And a few years ago, it was an Israeli guy that copied the number of his grandfather on his hand. So here the transmission, yeah? Get to the end, the transmission of the process. So this is something about the transmission, that the way...
Yeah. No, I also thought that it was fascinating as a positionality for perhaps a curator, rather than notion, that it's sort of the suggestion I took with me yesterday is that one could be much more, what would be implicated in the communication by thinking through the troubledness of transmission,
Of the mission of the transmission? Or
Perhaps, or the analysis and the kind of self-involvement in the analysis. I mean, specifically, I suppose he's talking about the notion of atrocities, but I'm just wondering if it's a kind of interesting or useful term. for us.
Can I just take Shaheen to task a little bit? Your counsel of despair about the art world is all very well, but let's see where Homi Bhabha started. He started with the Zeppelinfeld in Nuremberg, and they cannot be anywhere more despairing or more desperate than that site of mass conviction. And he seemed, from starting there, to try and take a position in relationship to that history, which doesn't try to erase it, which doesn't start with the UN or some kind of hopeful moment, but starts with that moment. And it seems to me that there's a responsibility for us as actors in the artistic field. I don't care what we call ourselves. I think the nomenclatures are irrelevant in this sense. I mean, they're important in the specifics, but we're all actors within the field. That it behoves us, to take a position knowing that desperate situation, which is a desperate situation that the art world simply reflects. I mean, the art world is simply a reflection, it seems to me, of other desperations that exist elsewhere, which are to do with what Roger Burgel called last week world integrated capitalism. We can call it many other terms, yeah? What he seemed to be suggesting is that we were in a time of transition, in a moment of transitionality. And at that moment, there are going to be very little clues as to how we might find a way out of that desperation, how we might be able to accommodate the fact that not only did the Zeppelinfeld exist, but as he said, that it will happen again. And we know it will happen again. But in the confrontation of that knowledge, if we simply give up, if we simply live for the moment when it's not existing, or not existing in our backyard, perhaps we should add, it seems to me an abrogation of any kind of responsibility you would have as a cultural actor. Fine if you were working in the financial industries for Allianz or something in Berlin. Fine, give up, Shaheen. I have no problem with that. You know, that would be your decision, and you'd be a lot richer and probably a lot happier. But given the fact that what you're doing, it seems to me that there's an irresponsibility on your behalf not to take a position of dealing with that despair in a way which might, in some sense, even slightly ameliorated.
I don't think it's about not taking responsibility. It's about being confident in able to talk about the situation. I find the space where art is mediated in, to a certain extent. Because I think we just take it for granted that this just is a natural condition of art and the art world, that things just developed the way that they're developed. What I was suggesting is that there's a controlling mechanism and an ideological structure within which all of this unfolds. And in its unfolding, we have to view it. And I think if we go back to this notion of slowness, that we have to think about the slow release of material and positions, rather than hasten and be beckoned by it all the time. Because at the end of the day, we can destabilize it, but we're trying to work against something which is a controlling mechanism. As they say, it's a kind of controlled democracy, in a sense. And it's a constructed material, it's resourced, it has a material base, it has control of both the political as well as the aesthetic outflowing within the public sphere. And I think that I'm aware of that when I make decisions about how I help to construct a type of history in the way that I make decisions. So it's not an irresponsibility, it's actually about trying to be creative as such within a system which has its boundaries, and some of those boundaries are very much policed around ethnic and religious nowadays, more and more so. And I'm not only talking about the European, I'm talking about a more international domain. And I'm not also talking just about the European condition, I'm talking about a much more international condition, which I find myself looking at, especially in Asia.
Sorry, can I just...
Yeah, one more, because I think I lost the question over there.
Absolutely. No, thanks for that. I was glad to hear that you were saying that you were trying to respond creatively to this situation. But I also thought maybe it's worthwhile remembering that picture that Homi Bhabha gave us towards the end of his talk when he related himself to Frederick Jameson, and where he said that Frederick Jameson was looking for I mean, in a sense, we all are nostalgically looking for the solution, which can encompass the whole of global capitalism. So in other words, if global capitalism is so big, you need a theory which is even bigger in order to take it on. And I think, in a sense, if you're trying to do that, you end up in a desperate situation or a despairing situation. Yeah. But what he said was, if it's so big, there are entry points. Yeah. And the entry points are what we can maybe use in order to move and in order to negotiate. And that, for me, was very inspiring, because I think we need to, not to do down Jameson, but I think this idea of having a system of thought which is bigger than the system of global capitalism is a big ask, you could say.
The only thing I want to say is that there are permanent states of poverty and exclusion, and there are also new sites of poverty and inequality, which is what he pointed out yesterday. So we just have to be very, very careful and not run with the goodie bags from the Frieze Art Fair and think everybody has reached there, because, But I think there is a certain amount of that celebration. No, I'm talking about the larger structure of the way that the art world is responding to the way of arriving. And that point of arrival, to me, is something which has to be contested.
Yes. I think I lost a question over this side of the hall just before the question about Tokyo tonight. So may I come back to you? Thank you very much. Sorry, you've had to wait. I apologize. The mic is coming to you.
Yes, the question is concerning the video, one of the videos you showed of the interviewers in the streets, asking them how they reacted to this attack, or, well, anyways. Maybe my question does come from, let's say, I'm from Colombia, and it's also a place where there is a domestication of violence in the day-to-day life. Maybe, let's say, the battle does occur in the rural areas concerning the battle with the Marxist-Leninist guerrilla, the paramilitaries, but once in a while you do get, let's say, a specific moment of violence in the city, let it be a bomb in a building, or even there have been bombs in envelopes that were sent to certain senators, but you just don't obviously react to it because you're just so used to it that it's completely domesticated. And I'm wondering if these types of practices that do have like this certain jackass aesthetics, do they really create like a certain criticality, or would they just fill in more into this domestication of violence? And I'm not saying that they're not having a position, but I'm wondering if you're so into this kind of practices, do you think that this comedy will be suggesting like a critical point towards that? Or because I'm thinking also like within, let's say, the US contest is, I don't know, Saturday Night Live does have like this criticality within this comedy that may be familiar to this practice, but yet again, let's say the American public just laughs to it, and there's no really, I don't know, understanding the problem. Or
okay, I can say two things related to this video. One, I think it was like around 96, 97, that we had in Israel a lot of suicide bombers. So I think, during this time, the television was open for 24 hours. After any one of the event, 24 hours. For 2 or 3 hours, it was live. Everything was live on TV. Later on, you have the, the material, the repeating of the material for 24 hours. Today, if you have a football game and something happened, and you have like any suicide bomber or any other, let's say, thing on the street, a violent action, so the football game will not stop. You have the ticker text that announce it. So I think it's something that, as you say, it became part of your life. But I think this film not dealing just with the way, and you said the people will practice. They know what to say. I can, in Hebrew, you can recognize exactly the expression that you will hear on the television during one of those kind of events. So they're repeating like the audience on the street. Like it's very common. But I think what they try to deal with, it's not just. It was not for a suicide bomber, it was during the war. They made this work during the war, and it was kind of a global or country paranoia that the Hezbollah will attack Tel Aviv. And Tel Aviv, it's not the capital, but it's the, let's say, the soft belly of Israel. If something happened in Tel Aviv, then there is a crisis. And I think this is what they try to elaborate around it. That the war, it's not there. It's not just in the north. What will happen with this kind of announcement, like everyday announcement that keep everybody aware, and other, like a very beautiful control of the paranoia of the war. If it will happen here in the city inside. I think this is what it was related then to the event itself.
Can I just ask one observation? Or as far as I remember, work by Ruti and Mayan, and I'm not, I haven't seen this piece. I've seen, I think, number 3, Beyond Guilt. Was it as a response to soldiers who came out of the army, who were then given sort of access to work out their fantasies, as well as their possibly aggressive fantasies on women? Was that what I remember talking to them about, was what their reading was of what they were doing? And I think if that is out there, it might actually give an access to what that work is about. It's a bit of information which I think is missing in reading that. And in that sense, it opens up this whole relationship of how do we deal with what Baba, I think, called understand casuality, which I think is an important way to bring it back to what Baba was saying, is that there's a lot of casualty out there. And how do we understand it? How do we come to understand it? And they were, as artists, offering themselves, in a sense, as guinea pigs in this experiment to try to understand the aggression that's generated by enforced army, what is the word?
Yeah, it's military society.
It's a military society. And I think it's important to give those sort of bits of information, because otherwise it looks like what he's exactly saying, this jackass stupidity, without actually saying, oh, this is all about young art. It's not about youth. It's actually about looking at society's structure. And those structures impede in the way that we grow up within it. And then how artists respond to those structures. And I think that's where the difference is that how do we embed that back into that viewing?
Yeah, it's true. The soldiers, all of them, all the young people are in the army. It should during the weekend, and every 3 weeks, so once a month, you have like a weekend at home. And so the meeting was in a pickup bar in Tel Aviv. It was everything shot in one night. Yeah. And yeah, the artists like kind of test themselves because they are there. It's not just the subject of or the object of. It's themselves taking part and generate the situation, which is very different than the observers or the one that looking at the society. They're also part in the society. Of course, they provoke, but nothing was set before. It was one night intervention and the result. And yeah, especially dealing with the militarized society, violence and sexuality, of course, that related. And
yeah, and of course also the rise of rape within that society. Which is what they talked about.
Yes. Wait for the mic, and then I think this would be the last question, I think. One more. Yes, sorry.
I tend to agree with what was said here, because I think the films of Itamar and, I forgot his other name, but...
Yossi and Itamar.
Yossi and Itamar could be jackass on TV, and there are things like that, just as provocative on TV. But I think then it really shows how the context matters when it's between advertising, and selling, whatever, detergent. yes, it becomes, that's what it's serving, this kind of thing. And I could think of many examples like Khamishiya Kamerit or whatever that were just as provocative and maybe even took it even further on Israeli TV and just like on American TV, and I'm sure they have it in every country or that has commercial television because people like to watch it and it's popular. So I really don't think it's much different. I just think that it's a lower budget in the filming. You know, if it was on TV, maybe it just would have been done a higher quality of production.
Sorry, I just don't want to judge the jazz aesthetics. That's why my question was like, how do you deal with it and how do you find it as a place of criticality? I mean, I'm not saying in the case of Colombia if Doris Salcedo is more successful because she has a poetic, political aesthetic that people can address to it in a more, I don't know, artistic way, as you've seen at Tate's Crack. But it's not about who is more successful than the other, but I was just curious, like, you seem to have like this specific interest in these types of
yeah, I choose today, you know, it was kind of, let's say, VJ experience that we decided about the program, and I have other program that I will continue with my journey. I decided like to focus about Psado, the commentary film that I think generated, I think you can see this kind of a genre also in ex-Yugoslavia, you know, after and during the war, that work that today it changed a bit, the work are more metaphorical, more allegorical, but during the war you will see a lot of work that dealing with kind of pseudo the commentary as a comment to the everyday live TV and you know other kind of and also kind of I think it's kind of a comment or try to advance, you know, what you have, you know, how the image of the war, the image of the everyday life during a wartime. So I think this genre, it's I can see it strongly, like in ex-Yugoslavia, but also in the region, like in now in the Middle East, very strongly, more than other places, which are.
Okay, and ask you, have you got the mic?
Shaheen, I would like to come back to the.
Can you wait for the mic? Yeah.
The mic.
Sorry.
Yeah, I would like to come back to some points that were for me very essential from Baba's talk and that you pointed out also today towards enunciation and erasure, and also to Charles, because I think there are many ways to address the despair and the cultural legacy. To start with, I would say also. In reference to Arendt, there was this recently published Responsibility of Judgment, where she says that there is a greater evil than the banality of evil, which is the one that one's erase his own gesture. And I would like to come back to the representation of the contemporary and in this perspective also how artists and eventually institutions also can contribute to writing another history, make space for other histories and stories, and shift beyond imagined geographies.
Well, I felt the conclusion yesterday, just looking back at my notes, before Charles's omnibus question, was one, Homi Bhabha talked about which I think he did talk about, I think he did, that's what I'm thinking my notes are saying, the movable economy of never again. And what I think he suggested is we take imaginative responsibility for those atrocities. But to a certain extent it also has a double-edged sword, it's also a location of denial, that we've dealt with it. He went on, and I remember one point, Geeta Kapoor talking about there's a kind of constant lack of reconciliation that demands of us all the time. How do we work this out? We can never, you know. So we are always on this brink of doubt and confrontation with ourselves and with our program making and the modes of representation that we use. How do we realize it? How do we do it? And to a certain extent, sometimes I have to turn to maybe the sort of meta way of looking at structures. One of the ways I look at, let's say, modernity is I always look through Gilroy's instructions of how do you embed modernity back into slavery. Because without slavery, there would be no modernity. Without Atlantic being a graveyard of 6 million or 10 million people, there would be no modernity. How do we put all of that together? Because it puts doubt back into something, which what he talked about right in the beginning of this finitude. It can never be finished. Modernity can never be finished. It's always on the edge of finishing and goes into postmodernity. So I think there is something in that despair, in that moment of despair. In that moment, you also look at what is culture, what is the legacies of culture, what are the real, actually, wider tangential developments of culture, which we have to take on, and what is cultural heritage beyond this fast pace that we tend to take. And I think what was very interesting for me was that he talked about this ethical condition as a curse. And that cursing, in a sense, is because we haven't resolved. And we're not about to resolve it either, because if anything, we've added to it. Especially recently with what's going on in Iraq and what's going on in Lebanon and what's also going on in Burma. I think all of these places are real hot flashes which talk about the fact that we need to be very concerned of what we think we're doing in forms of civilization and sharing and multiculturality.
Galit, would you like to respond to me, say a little more? No?
I'm just there.
Okay, then I think we will close for lunch here. I thank my participants heartily for a very interesting morning. I thank the audience too. I think there are things that will be running on for the rest of the day and indeed the rest of the caucus, the role of the museum. The question of whether there is globalization and or global ambivalence, I think, will hang in the air a long time. The role of humor in relation to criticality, I think, is a new issue that's come onto the stage, and we might want to think about that a little more. The question of situated knowledges seems to me to come back from Homi's talk again about the need to engage with situatedness within the global. And if I think we could just add to that raft of list of countries that Shaheen's just mentioned, many of us are particularly concerned about the situation now in Pakistan. Whether we've heard from artists, from people who teach in art colleges, people we know who are curators, and there are that kind of arena of concern for us, particularly at the moment, would include, I think, Pakistan as much as Burma and Iraq. I don't want to close on a too depressing note after a rather cautionary tale this morning in many ways, but to say, Charles, what, 2:15 to take the academic quarter again? Yes? Okay, so to recommence at 2:15. Thank you.